The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I knew before opening it that Susan Patterson was about to make my life hell again. My name is Vincent Wright, and I run a small consulting business from my home office in the prestigious Meadowbrook Estates subdivision in Scottsdale, Arizona. The subdivision is one of those perfectly manicured communities where every blade of grass seems to stand at attention, and every mailbox is exactly the same shade of bronze. When I bought my house here 5 years ago, I did not realize I was also buying myself a front row seat to the most dramatic HOA board in the entire state. The letter was predictably formal and dripping with manufactured authority. It informed me that I was in violation of Section 4.7 of the HOA covenants, which prohibited running commercial businesses from residential properties. I had 30 days to cease all business operations or face a daily fine of $500, with potential legal action to follow. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the letter and trying to remember if I had ever mentioned to anyone in the neighborhood what I did for a living. My consulting work was entirely digital. I had no clients visiting my home, no signage, no business vehicles, nothing that would distinguish my house from any other on the block. I worked from a laptop in my spare bedroom, occasionally taking video calls and sending out invoices. That was it. The phone rang within the hour. It was Marcus Henderson, my property manager. "Vincent, we need to talk," he said, his voice tense. "Let me guess," I replied. "Susan Patterson called you." "She did. She is demanding we do something about your business operations. She claims you are running an illegal enterprise from the property." I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. "Marcus, you know what I do. I am a business consultant. I work from home like millions of other Americans. I do not have customers coming and going. I do not even get business mail delivered here. How did she even find out?" "LinkedIn," Marcus said with a sigh. "Apparently, she has been doing research on every homeowner in the subdivision. She found your profile and saw that your listed business address is your home address. That is insane." "That is literally insane." "I know. But Vincent, there is something else you need to know. The HOA board is not just going after you. They have been sending out violation notices left and right. 3 families got cited for having their garage doors open during daylight hours. The Mitchells got fined because their teenage son parked his car on the street overnight. It is getting out of control." I had heard rumors, of course. Susan Patterson had been elected HOA president 2 years ago, running on a platform of maintaining property values and community standards. What that actually meant was she had transformed the neighborhood into her personal fiefdom, wielding the HOA bylaws like a weapon against anyone who dared to plant the wrong shade of rose bush or paint their front door without written approval. "What do you suggest I do?" I asked Marcus. There was a long pause. "Honestly, you might want to consider just telling her you will stop, even if you do not actually stop. Just keep your head down until her term is up. That is another 1.5 years, Marcus, and I am not doing anything wrong. I know. But fighting the HOA is expensive and exhausting. Trust me, I have seen it destroy people." After I hung up with Marcus, I did what any rational person would do in 2025. I started researching. I pulled up the HOA covenants, the Arizona state laws regarding HOAs, and started making notes. Section 4.7 did indeed prohibit commercial businesses, but the language was clearly intended to prevent things like running a daycare, a repair shop, or a retail operation. Activities that would increase traffic, create noise, or otherwise disturb the residential character of the neighborhood. My consulting work did none of those things. In fact, The only reason anyone even knew I ran a business was because Susan had apparently decided to stalk everyone on social media. I was in the middle of drafting a response letter when something occurred to me. Something that made me set down my pen and start laughing. I owned this house. But I also owned 6 other properties in Meadowbrook Estates. 5 years ago, before I moved to Scottsdale, I had been living in San Francisco working for a major tech company. I had done well for myself, saved aggressively, and when I decided to leave the corporate world and start my own consulting practice, I had cashed out my stock options and looked for investment opportunities. Meadowbrook Estates had been in the early stages of development, and the builder was offering incentives for bulk purchases. I had bought 7 properties total, 1 to live in and 6 as rental investments. The rental market in Scottsdale was strong, and the properties had appreciated nicely. Marcus managed all of them for me, handling tenant relations, maintenance, and rent collection. I had been so hands-off that I honestly had not thought much about who was living in those houses. I called Marcus back. "Quick question," I said. "Can you send me the current tenant list for my rental properties?" "Sure, give me a second," I heard him typing. "Okay, you have got 2847 Desert Bloom Drive, 2851 Desert Bloom, 3102 Cactus Way, 3156 Cactus Way, 4429 Sunset Ridge, and 4430 Sunset Ridge. You want the tenant names, please." He read them off. The first 2 names meant nothing to me. The third one made me sit up straight. "Wait, say that again." 3102 Cactus Way. "Yeah, that is David Patterson. He and his wife Susan. They have been renting from you for about 18 months now." I felt a grin spreading across my face. "Susan Patterson. As in HOA President Susan Patterson?" "Oh damn," Marcus said. "I did not even make that connection. Yeah, that is her. They are paying $2,800 a month." And the others, as Marcus continued reading, the picture became even more beautiful. Out of the 6 rental properties I owned, 4 of them were occupied by HOA board members or their family members. Susan Patterson, the president; Jennifer Walsh, the vice president; Robert Chen, the treasurer; and Kevin Morrison, a board member who had been Susan's most vocal supporter. I had been so focused on my consulting work and so hands-off with the rental properties that I had never bothered to learn who my tenants were beyond the automatic rent deposits that hit my account each month. Marcus handled everything. But now, this information was suddenly very relevant. "Marcus," I said slowly, "I need you to pull the lease agreements for all 6 properties. I want to review them personally." "What are you thinking?" "I am thinking that Susan Patterson just made a very serious mistake." The lease agreements arrived in my email within the hour. I spent the rest of the afternoon reviewing them carefully, making notes and cross-referencing with Arizona landlord-tenant law. All 6 leases were standard 1-year agreements with month-to-month extensions after the initial term. Most of them were currently in month-to-month status. The leases were clean, professional, and ironclad. More importantly, none of them had any special provisions or restrictions. They were straightforward rental agreements for residential properties. But they all had standard clauses about lease violations, proper notice periods, and termination conditions. I was not going to evict anyone. That would be petty, probably illegal retaliation, and frankly beneath me. But I was going to make sure that Susan Patterson understood exactly who she was dealing with. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center. These meetings were technically open to all residents, though most people did not bother attending unless they had a specific complaint or concern. I had never been to one. That was about to change. Thursday evening arrived, and I drove the short distance to the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center. It was a small building near the main entrance of the subdivision, with a meeting room, a kitchenette, and an office that the HOA used for official business. When I walked in, about 15 people were scattered around the room in folding chairs. Susan Patterson sat at a table at the front, flanked by Jennifer Walsh and Robert Chen. Kevin Morrison sat to the side, reviewing some papers. Susan looked up when I entered, and I saw recognition flash across her face. She was probably in her mid-40s, with the kind of severe haircut that seemed designed to intimidate. She wore a blazer despite the Arizona heat and had a nameplate in front of her that read President Patterson. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice neutral. "We were not expecting you this evening. These meetings are open to residents, are they not?" I took a seat in the front row, directly across from her. "Of course. We welcome community participation." Her tone suggested the opposite. The meeting started with standard business. Approval of the previous meeting's minutes, a financial report from Robert Chen, a discussion about landscaping contracts. I sat quietly, watching the dynamics of the board. Susan clearly ran the show, with Jennifer nodding along to everything she said. Robert seemed more independent, occasionally pushing back on spending items. Kevin mostly stayed quiet. Then came new business. "We have several covenant violation cases to discuss," Susan said, pulling out a folder. "First, we have Vincent Wright of 2855 Desert Bloom Drive. Mr. Wright is operating a commercial business from his residential property in direct violation of Section 4.7. All eyes turned to me. I remained calm, my hands folded in my lap. "Mr. Wright, would you like to address the board?" Susan asked. I stood up. "I would, thank you. First, I want to clarify what my business actually is. I am a consultant. I work from home using a laptop and a phone. I have no clients visiting my property, no employees, no signage, no business vehicles, and no inventory. My work is indistinguishable from someone who works remotely for an employer. The only difference is that I invoice clients directly rather than receiving a W-2. "The covenant is clear," Susan interrupted. "No commercial businesses. The covenant is clear about its intent," I countered, "which is to prevent businesses that would disrupt the residential character of the neighborhood. My work does not do that in any way. In fact, I would argue that someone who works from home is a better neighbor than someone who leaves for an office every day because I am around to keep an eye on things and maintain my property." Jennifer Walsh spoke up. "But you are making money from the property." "No, I am making money while at the property. That is different. By your logic, anyone who works remotely would be in violation. Are you going to go after everyone who telecommutes?" Susan's expression hardened. "Mr. Wright, the board has made its decision. You have 30 days to cease business operations or face fines and potential legal action. If you wish to appeal, you may submit a written request, which the board will review at our discretion." I smiled. It was time to play my card. "Before we move on," I said, "I have a question about the board composition. Is it true that all board members must be residents of Meadowbrook Estates?" Susan looked confused by the question. "Yes, that is correct. It is in the bylaws. And all current board members are residents, of course." "Interesting. And there is no conflict of interest policy regarding board members who might have business relationships with each other or with other residents?" Robert Chen frowned. "What are you getting at, Mr. Wright?" I pulled out a folder I had brought with me. "I am getting at the fact that 4 out of 5 current board members are my tenants. President Patterson, you live at 3102 Cactus Way, correct?" The room went completely silent. Susan's face went pale, then red. "Vice President Walsh, you live at 3156 Cactus Way. Treasurer Chen, 4429 Sunset Ridge. And Mr. Morrison, 4430 Sunset Ridge. I own all 4 properties. I am your landlord." Jennifer Walsh actually gasped. Robert Chen sat back in his chair, his eyes wide. Kevin Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "That is irrelevant," Susan sputtered. "This has nothing to do with our rental agreements." "Does it not?" I remained standing, keeping my voice level and professional. "Because it seems to me that we have a significant conflict of interest here. You are using your position as HOA president to threaten a property owner who also happens to be your landlord. One could argue that this is an abuse of power." "How dare you?" Susan hissed. "Are you threatening us?" "I am not threatening anyone. I am simply pointing out a fact that I think the community should be aware of. You are making decisions that directly affect someone who has significant financial leverage over your housing situation. That is, at minimum, an appearance of impropriety." Another resident, an older man I did not recognize, spoke up from the back. "Hold on. You own 4 properties in this neighborhood and you are renting them to HOA board members. 6 properties, actually," I said. "I live in one and rent out the other 6. 4 of those 6 happen to be occupied by board members. It was not intentional. I had no idea who my tenants were until this week because I use a property manager. But now that I do know, I think it is important information." Susan stood up, her hands gripping the table. "This meeting is adjourned. Everyone out, now." "You cannot just adjourn the meeting because you do not like what is being discussed," Robert Chen said quietly. He was staring at Susan with an expression I could not quite read. "Susan, did you know about this?" "Of course I did not know about this." "But you knew he was a property owner before you sent that violation letter," Robert continued. "You had to know because you would have checked the property records, so you knew he owned his house. Did you check to see what else he owned?" Susan did not answer. The silence was damning. Jennifer Walsh found her voice. "Susan, if this gets out, it could invalidate every decision this board has made for the past 18 months. We could be personally liable for damages." "Nobody is liable for anything," Susan snapped. "We are enforcing the covenants. That is our job." I decided to push a little harder. "Actually, there is a good argument that selective enforcement of covenants is a violation of Arizona HOA law. If you are going after me for working from home but ignoring other residents who do the same, that is selective enforcement. And if the reason for that selective enforcement is because of a personal conflict of interest, that opens the board up to legal liability." The older man from the back stood up. "I am Bill Hendricks, and I have lived here for 8 years. Susan, you have been out of control for months. We all know it. This is just the final straw. I move that we hold a special election to recall the entire board." Several other residents began talking at once. Susan tried to regain control, banging her hand on the table, but the meeting had dissolved into chaos. I sat back down and watched as the community that Susan had ruled with an iron fist for 2 years began to turn against her. After about 10 minutes of arguing, Robert Chen stood up and raised his hands for quiet. "Everyone, please, let us take a breath here. Mr. Wright, I think you have made your point. Susan, I think we need to table the violation notice against Mr. Wright pending a full board review of our enforcement policies. I also think we need to discuss potential conflicts of interest and whether some of us should recuse ourselves from decisions involving Mr. Wright's properties." "I will not be recusing myself from anything," Susan said. "I was elected to do a job and I am going to do it." "Then I am resigning from the board," Robert said simply, "effective immediately. I am not going to be part of this disaster when it inevitably ends up in court." Jennifer Walsh looked between Susan and Robert, clearly torn. Finally, she said, "I think I need to resign as well. This is too messy." Susan's face was now a deep shade of crimson. "You are all cowards. Fine. I will run this board myself if I have to." "You cannot," I said. "The bylaws require a minimum of 3 board members for a quorum. If you only have yourself and Mr. Morrison, you cannot conduct official business." Kevin Morrison raised his hand tentatively. "I think I should resign too. I am sorry, Susan, but this is not what I signed up for." And just like that, the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board collapsed. The following weeks were chaotic. An emergency community meeting was called to elect an interim board. I was approached by several residents who asked if I would consider serving, but I declined. I had no interest in running the HOA. I just wanted to be left alone to do my work. A new board was elected, composed of residents who seemed more interested in maintaining basic community standards than in exercising petty tyranny. The violation notice against me was formally withdrawn with an apology. The new board also implemented a conflict of interest policy that required board members to disclose any business relationships with other residents. Susan Patterson did not go quietly. She threatened to sue me for harassment and intimidation. She sent me a letter through her attorney claiming that I had abused my position as her landlord to interfere with HOA business. The letter was laughable, and my own attorney responded with a detailed explanation of why her claims had no legal merit. What Susan did not know was that I had also been doing some additional research. I had requested copies of all HOA financial records for the past 2 years, which I was entitled to as a homeowner. And what I found was deeply troubling. There were dozens of unexplained expenses. Payments to vendors that did not seem to have any corresponding work done. Reimbursements to Susan for supplies and services that were not adequately documented. In total, I estimated that somewhere around $30,000 had been spent without proper documentation or approval. I was not the only one who noticed. Bill Hendricks, the older man who had spoken up at the meeting, turned out to be a retired accountant. He had also requested the financial records and had come to similar conclusions. Together, we compiled a detailed report and presented it to the new board. The new board president, a retired teacher named Margaret Foster, took the matter seriously. She hired a forensic accountant to review the HOA's books. The accountant's report was even more damning than our initial findings. Susan had been systematically siphoning money from the HOA for nearly 2 years, using her position to approve payments to herself and to vendors who either did not exist or had performed far less work than they had been paid for. The total came to just over $47,000. Margaret called me personally to discuss the findings. "Vincent, this is fraud. We need to report this to the police." "I agree," I said, "but I want to make sure we have everything documented properly. Susan will fight this and we need to be ready." The accountant said the evidence is solid. She created fake invoices, approved payments to herself, and even set up a couple of shell companies to funnel money through. It is textbook embezzlement. I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. I had not set out to destroy Susan Patterson. I just wanted to run my business in peace. But her own actions had led to this moment. The new board voted unanimously to file a police report. 2 weeks later, Susan Patterson was arrested at her home and charged with multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement. The local news covered the story, describing how an HOA president had stolen from her own community to fund personal expenses. During the investigation, it came out that Susan and her husband David were in serious financial trouble. David had lost his job 8 months earlier and had not found new employment. They were behind on their rent and facing potential eviction before all of this happened. Susan had apparently seen the HOA funds as a way to keep herself afloat. It did not excuse what she had done, but it explained it. Desperation makes people do terrible things. David Patterson came to see me about a week after Susan's arrest. He knocked on my door on a Saturday morning, looking exhausted and defeated. "Mr. Wright," he said when I opened the door, "I know I am probably the last person you want to see, but I wanted to talk to you." I invited him in and offered him coffee. We sat at my kitchen table, the same place where I had first read Susan's violation letter all those weeks ago. "I am sorry," David said, "for everything. I did not know what Susan was doing with the HOA money. I swear I did not know, but I should have asked more questions. I should have wondered where the extra money was coming from. David, you are not responsible for your wife's choices. I know, but I am responsible for mine." And I chose to look the other way when things did not add up. He ran his hands through his hair. "We are going to lose everything, are we not? I do not know. That is up to the courts. But David, I want you to know that I am not trying to make your life harder. I am not going to evict you. You can stay in the house as long as you keep paying rent. What Susan did does not change your lease." His eyes filled with tears. "Why? Why would you do that after everything she did to you? Because you are not Susan, and because putting you on the street does not help anyone." "You have kids, right?" He nodded. "2, 13 and 15. Then they need stability right now more than ever. Just keep paying your rent and we will be fine." David left shortly after, thanking me repeatedly. I watched him walk back to his car and wondered if I was making the right decision. But it felt right. Susan had made her choices, and she would face the consequences. But her family did not need to be punished any more than they already were. The criminal case moved forward. Susan's attorney tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the district attorney was not interested in going easy on her. Embezzlement from an HOA was taken seriously in Arizona, especially in wealthy subdivisions like Meadowbrook Estates. The DA wanted to make an example of her. The trial took place 6 months after her arrest. I attended several days of the proceedings, mostly out of curiosity. The evidence was overwhelming. The forensic accountant walked the jury through dozens of fraudulent transactions. Susan's attorney tried to argue that she had intended to pay the money back, that it was temporary borrowing. But the prosecution destroyed that argument by showing how she had concealed her activities and lied about them when first questioned. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge was harsh. Susan was given 4 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 2 years. She was also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, though everyone knew that was unlikely to happen given her financial situation. I watched as she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. She did not look at me or at anyone else. She stared straight ahead, her face blank. David filed for divorce 3 weeks later. I heard through the neighborhood gossip mill that he had found a job and was trying to rebuild his life. His kids were struggling but getting counseling. I saw them occasionally when I drove through the neighborhood, and I always waved. Sometimes they waved back. The HOA itself underwent a major transformation. Margaret Foster and the new board implemented strict financial controls, requiring dual approval for all expenditures and quarterly audits by an independent accountant. They also rewrote large portions of the covenants to remove the more absurd restrictions that Susan had championed. The prohibition on home businesses was revised to focus specifically on activities that would create nuisances. Working from home was explicitly permitted as long as it did not involve customers coming to the property, signage, or other disruptive activities. The new language made sense and reflected the reality of how many people worked in 2025. Several other residents who had been targeted by Susan's enforcement crusade had their fines refunded. The neighborhood became noticeably more relaxed. People started actually talking to each other instead of living in fear of violation notices. I continued running my consulting business without any further interference. In fact, my business actually grew during this period. The stress and drama of the HOA situation had pushed me to focus more intensely on my work, and I landed several major clients. My income increased significantly, which allowed me to make some improvements to my rental properties. Marcus and I developed a better system for managing the properties. I started paying more attention to who my tenants were and making sure the properties were well maintained. I increased the rent modestly on a couple of the units, but I also invested in upgrades that made them more valuable. It was a better balance than my previous completely hands-off approach. Jennifer Walsh, the former vice president, moved out of her rental property about 8 months after everything happened. She bought a house in a different subdivision, telling me she needed a fresh start. I understood and helped make her move-out process as smooth as possible. Kevin Morrison stayed. He apologized to me multiple times for going along with Susan's campaign against me. He explained that he had been new to the board and had not felt comfortable challenging her. I accepted his apology, and we developed a cordial relationship. He turned out to be a decent guy who had just been in over his head. Robert Chen also stayed. He actually became a friend. We started having coffee occasionally, and I learned that he had his own history with difficult HOAs. He had moved to Meadowbrook Estates specifically because it seemed well run at the time, only to watch it deteriorate under Susan's leadership. He was relieved when the new board took over and actually served on several committees to help reform the HOA's practices. About a year after Susan's sentencing, I was working in my home office when I got a call from an unknown number. I almost did not answer it, but something made me pick up. "This is Vincent." "Mr. Wright, this is Susan Patterson." I sat up straight, startled. "Susan. I was not expecting to hear from you. I am calling from prison. I get limited phone privileges." Her voice was different, smaller. The arrogance and anger were gone. "I wanted to apologize to you for everything." I did not know what to say. I had not thought about Susan much in the past few months. She had been a problem that got resolved and I had moved on. "I was wrong," she continued. "About all of it. You were not doing anything wrong. I was just so angry and desperate, and I took it out on you and a lot of other people who did not deserve it." "Why me specifically?" I asked. "There were other people working from home. Why did you target me?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because you seemed successful. Your house is one of the nicest in the neighborhood. You drove a nice car. You seemed to have everything figured out. And I was drowning, and I guess I wanted to drag someone else down with me." It was honest, at least. Brutally so. "I am not asking you to forgive me," Susan said. "I do not deserve that. I just wanted you to know that I am sorry, and that I am glad you did not evict David. He told me you let him stay. That meant a lot." "How is he doing?" I asked. "As well as can be expected. The divorce is almost final. He has got a good job now. The kids are doing better. He is a good man. He deserves better than what I put him through." We talked for a few more minutes. She told me about her plans for when she got out, how she was taking courses and trying to better herself. I did not know if she was sincere or just saying what she thought I wanted to hear, but I listened. When she hung up, I sat in my office for a long time, thinking about the strange path that had led from that first violation notice to this phone call. Susan had tried to use her power to force me out, not knowing that I actually had more power than she did. But I had not used that power to destroy her. She had destroyed herself. The rental properties continued to be good investments. Property values in Scottsdale kept climbing, and my equity grew substantially. I eventually sold 2 of the properties, using the proceeds to invest in a small commercial building that I converted into office space for lease. It was a natural extension of my real estate portfolio, and it diversified my income streams. My consulting business thrived. I specialized in helping small businesses optimize their operations, and I developed a reputation for delivering results. I hired a couple of contractors to help with overflow work, though I kept the core business small and manageable. Working from home continued to be ideal for my needs. The HOA at Meadowbrook Estates became something of a model for how an HOA should function. Margaret Foster served as president for 2 years before stepping down, and the boards that followed maintained the reforms she had implemented. The community became known for being well managed without being oppressive. I eventually joined the board myself, serving a 2-year term as treasurer. I figured I owed it to the community after everything that had happened. I used my business background to help streamline the HOA's finances and create better budgeting processes. It was actually more satisfying than I expected, seeing the community come together to make decisions collectively, rather than having them imposed from above. David Patterson moved out about 2 years after Susan went to prison. He had met someone new and was moving in with her across town. His kids were doing well in school, and he had been promoted at his job. When he came to return his keys, he shook my hand and thanked me again for not making a difficult time worse. "You could have destroyed us," he said. "You would have had every right to. But you did not, and I will never forget that." After he left, I walked through the empty house, making notes about what needed to be repaired or updated before the next tenant moved in. It was just another rental property, another business transaction, but it represented something more than that. It represented the choice to be decent even when you did not have to be. I thought about Susan's phone call sometimes. I never heard from her again after that one conversation. I hoped she was doing better, that she had learned from her mistakes and was building a better life. But I did not know, and I realized I did not need to know. Her story was separate from mine now. The whole experience taught me several important lessons. First, that power dynamics can shift in unexpected ways. Susan had assumed she had power over me because she was the HOA president, but she had not bothered to understand the full picture. Second, that conflicts of interest are real and serious, and organizations need clear policies to address them. Third, that desperate people do desperate things, and sometimes the person who seems most aggressive is actually the most vulnerable. But the biggest lesson was about knowing when to fight and when to let things go. I could have simply complied with Susan's violation notice, stopped listing my business address as my home, and avoided the whole confrontation. But that would have been wrong, and it would have enabled her to continue her abusive behavior toward others. By standing up to her, I inadvertently exposed a much larger problem that needed to be addressed. At the same time, I could have used my position as her landlord to retaliate, to make her life miserable, to evict her family when they were already struggling. But that would have been cruel and unnecessary. Justice was served through the legal system, not through personal revenge. Meadowbrook Estates continued to be a good place to live and invest. The subdivision maintained its property values, the common areas were well kept, and the HOA functioned smoothly. New families moved in, people came and went, and life moved forward. I still own 4 properties in the subdivision, including my home. The rental income continues to be strong, and the properties have appreciated to the point where my initial investment has more than tripled in value. I sometimes think about selling them and moving on to other investments. But there is something satisfying about being part of the community. My consulting business evolved over the years. I specialized more narrowly in helping companies navigate organizational conflicts and power dynamics, drawing on my own experiences. I wrote articles and gave talks about conflict resolution and ethical leadership. The HOA situation became a case study I used in my work, anonymized and generalized, but rooted in the real lessons I had learned. I never ran for HOA president, despite several people encouraging me to do so. I served my 2 years as treasurer and then stepped down, content to participate as a regular member. I had no desire for that kind of power or responsibility. I had seen what it could do to people. The community center where that fateful board meeting had taken place was eventually renovated. They added a small plaque in the lobby listing the presidents who had served the HOA over the years. Susan Patterson's name is on there, marking her 2-year term. There is no asterisk, no explanation of what happened, just her name and her dates of service. Sometimes new residents ask me about the HOA's history, having heard rumors about past drama. I usually give them a simplified version, explaining that there were some financial irregularities that got resolved and that the current board is solid. I do not see the need to drag Susan's name through the mud years after the fact. She paid her debt to society, and the community moved on. I still work from my home office. I still take video calls from the spare bedroom where this whole story began. I still invoice clients with my home address listed. And the HOA does not care, because the current board understands the difference between a legitimate home business and a nuisance. On quiet evenings, I sometimes drive through the neighborhood, past the houses I own and the houses I do not, past the perfectly manicured lawns and the bronze mailboxes. I think about how this place almost became a battleground, how a simple violation notice almost spiraled into something much uglier than it needed to be. But it did not, because when the moment came, enough people chose to do the right thing. Robert Chen resigned rather than be part of something corrupt. Bill Hendricks spoke up when he saw injustice. Margaret Foster stepped up to lead when the community needed it, and I chose to stand up for myself without crushing those who had tried to wrong me. The story could have ended very differently. Susan could have succeeded in forcing me out, emboldened to continue her abuse of power. I could have evicted all my tenants in retaliation, leaving families homeless. The fraud could have continued undiscovered for years, draining the HOA's reserves. The community could have torn itself apart in conflict. Instead, the system worked more or less as it should. Wrongdoing was exposed and punished. Reforms were implemented. The community healed. It was not perfect, but it was good enough. I learned that being a landlord is about more than collecting rent. It is about providing stable housing for people and being part of a community. I learned that running a business from home is a normal part of modern life, and that HOAs need to adapt to that reality. I learned that conflicts of interest can corrupt even well-intentioned organizations if they are not properly managed. Most importantly, I learned that power is a responsibility, not a weapon. Whether it is the power of an HOA president or the power of a landlord, it comes with an obligation to use it wisely and fairly. Susan forgot that, or maybe never understood it in the first place. It cost her dearly. These days, when I get my monthly rental income reports from Marcus, I actually read them carefully. I know who my tenants are. I make sure the properties are maintained. I respond to repair requests promptly. I have become a better landlord, not because I have to be, but because I want to be. And when I sit down at my laptop each morning to start my work day, I feel grateful. Grateful that I can make a living doing something I enjoy. Grateful that I have the freedom to work from home. Grateful that I live in a community that, after some painful lessons, figured out how to balance rules with common sense. The whole experience made me a better businessman, a better landlord, and probably a better person. It forced me to engage with my community instead of hiding in my home office. It taught me when to fight and when to show mercy. It showed me that doing the right thing is not always easy, but it is always worth it. Susan Patterson tried to force me out for running a business, not knowing I was the landlord of every board member. But in the end, this story is not really about that ironic twist of fate. It is about how a community can be corrupted by one person's abuse of power, and how it can heal when people stand up for what is right. Meadowbrook Estates is a better place now than it was before all this happened. The HOA is stronger and more accountable. The residents are more engaged. The covenants make more sense. And everyone learned valuable lessons about transparency, ethics, and the importance of checking your power before you try to wield it against others. I still live at 2855 Desert Bloom Drive. I still run my consulting business from my home office. I still own rental properties in the neighborhood. And the HOA leaves me alone because I am not doing anything wrong and never was. Sometimes the best victories are the ones where everyone learns something and comes out better on the other side. This was one of those victories. It cost Susan Patterson dearly, and I genuinely regret that. But the alternative would have been to let corruption and abuse continue unchecked, and that would have cost the entire community far more. As I write this, several years after that first violation notice arrived, I can look back with perspective and see how all the pieces fit together. How my investment in rental properties, made years earlier for purely financial reasons, created the leverage I needed to stand up to an abusive HOA president. How Susan's own desperation and poor judgment led her down a path of fraud that would have been discovered eventually, with or without my involvement. How the community came together when it mattered most. The story has a clean ending, which real life does not always provide. Justice was served. Reforms were implemented. The community healed. People moved on. But the lessons remain, and I carry them with me in my work and in my life. I am Vincent Wright, owner of 7 properties in Meadowbrook Estates, Scottsdale, Arizona. I run a consulting business from my home. And I survived an HOA president who tried to force me out, only to discover that I was her landlord. It is a story I will probably be telling for the rest of my life. And every time I tell it, I am reminded of how important it is to understand the full picture before you start a fight you might not win.